Hello guys, this is Dr. Danial Qasim. For more details about my profile, kindly visit sqadia.com. So in today's lecture, we're going to discuss the propulsion of food from the mouth into the esophagus, and then the mixing of food in the stomach, and then how the defecation process do come into play. So this we were going to be discussing these topics in detail. A quick view about the lecture outline, that is ingestion of food, the peristaltic movements in the esophagus. We're going to discuss about the anatomy of the stomach, the vasovagal reflex, the motor functions of the stomach, the mixing and the emptying of the stomach, the movements of the small intestine, the movements of the colon, and the autonomic reflexes that affect the bowel activity, and the defecation reflex. So to begin with, once the food enters the mouth, there are some mechanical digestion, that is by teeth, by the breaking of food, by the crushing of food into smaller pieces. There is a chemical digestion with the help of saliva. Salivary enzymes are present which further digest the food into more digestible forms. That is amylase, which is an enzyme that digests starch. Then we have mucin, which is a slippery protein, mucus, that protects the soft lining of the digestive tract, that lubricates food for easier swallowing. Then we have buffers that neutralizes acid to prevent tooth decay, and there are antibacterial chemicals that kill bacteria that enter mouth during eating. So here's a picture, a quick view on the bolus of the food that entering into the mouth and pushing down into the esophagus. There's an epiglottis is lifted which covers the glottis so that the food can easily pass down to the esophagus and relaxing the esophageal sphincter, and this sphincter gets relaxed once the bolus of food reaches that portion of the esophagus, passing the epiglottis lid which covers the trachea so that the food doesn't enter into trachea. Now the pharyngeal stage of swallowing is involuntary. However, we have just discussed the voluntary action or the voluntary passage of food from the mouth into from the pharynx into the esophagus. So food is ready for swallowing. There is a voluntarily push into the pharynx by the tongue. The bolus of food stimulates swallowing receptors and impulses from these pass to the brainstem, and hence initiating a series of automatic pharyngeal muscle contractions, which are: soft palate is usually pulled upwards, preventing the reflux of food into the nasal cavities. The palatopharyngeal folds on the either side of the pharynx are pulled medially, forming a sagittal slit, impeding large objects into the posterior pharynx. Vocal folds are approximated, larynx is pulled upward and anteriorly by the neck muscles, and the epiglottis swings backwards, covering the larynx, preventing the food to enter into trachea. There is upper esophageal sphincter that relaxes, which is in the contracted state before the entry of the food. Once the food reaches that point, then the sphincter gets itself relaxed and the peristaltic waves are generated in the pharynx to push the food into the upper part of the esophagus. So the ingestion of food, the process of ingestion is quite appreciated in this diagram. As you can see, the soft, you can appreciate the soft palate. There's the nasopharynx. Then we have the epiglottis. There the vocal folds are present with the laryngopharynx portion. There's a trachea and the esophagus where the bolus of food needs to get enter. Now in the first step, once the food is inside the mouth and ready to move into the pharynx, The soft palate is pressed against the back of the nasopharynx, and it is voluntarily pushed with the help of tongue into the pharynx. And then the vocal folds, in the second step, the epiglottis tips down and back, closing airways, and it covers the larynx portion so that there is no chance of food to enter into trachea and causing a breathing problem. So epiglottis lid, it lifts upwards and closes the laryngeal or the larynx portion, so the food moves further downwards. There are cricopharyngeal sphincter muscles which opens up, and the food is passed into the esophagus. So once there are some movements through which the contraction and relaxation at the same time occurs in the tubular part of the alimentary tract. These are the worm-like movements by which the tubular organs or the alimentary tract canals with both longitudinal and circular muscles propel their contents, consisting of wave of contraction passing along the tube. You can see the food bolus. There's a contracted muscle, and there is a direction of food movement. The food is moving down from the pharynx into the esophagus. So there are peristaltic movements. These are the worm-like movement with the crest and trough. You can see there's a contraction on this part of the tubular canal. These are the contraction, and this is the relaxation, forming a worm-like movements. So the muscles get contracted over here and get relaxed over here. So that's how the peristaltic movements occur, and the food is passed down the canal. So esophageal peristaltic movements are two types of movement. One is primary peristalsis, and the second one is secondary peristalsis. So continuation of peristaltic wave that begins in pharynx. These waves passes down to the stomach. Secondary peristalsis is a distension of the esophagus when primary peristalsis fails. Lower esophageal sphincters relaxes and ahead of the peristaltic wave. It remains tonically constricted until peristaltic wave passes down the esophagus. So this is a deglutition with a swallowing process, the esophageal stage. Once the bolus of food makes an entry from the pharynx into the esophagus by the relaxation of the esophageal sphincter, there are peristaltic fields that are generated, the worm-like movements in the tubular portion with the contraction and the relaxation of the circular muscles of the tubules, and these are the series of involuntary waves that are generated with the receptors stimulated by the entry of food, and the peristaltic waves moving down to the esophagus and pushing the esophagus more towards stomach. So in this diagram, peristaltic waves are more prominent. You can see the contractions and the relaxations. The food, once it comes closer to this part, the contraction occurs, and the sphincters that are present at the junction of the esophagus and the stomach, they get relaxed, and so the food gets entry into the stomach. So after the food that is moved downwards from the pharynx into the esophagus makes an entry into the stomach. So before jumping directly into the stomach, that how the mixing occurs and how the food is then propelled forward, so before jumping right straight away to that portion, first we should know the anatomy of the stomach, which is very important, containing many glands, many cells, that are the important aspects in digestive processes. So stomach is divided into 4 parts. One is the cardiac portion, which forms the junction at the end of the esophagus and the start of the stomach lining. This is the cardiac portion. Then there's an outer curvature of fundus, which contains most of the glands of the stomach. Then we have the serosa, which is rich in serous fluid, which is lining membrane of the stomach. We have body. There are rugae of mucosa. Then there is a more greater curvature that is leading up to pyloric sphincter or the pyloric canal, and then that pylorus then enters into the duodenum, where the duodenum begins. So there's a lesser curvature, there is a greater curvature. Greater curvature is mostly occupied by the body, and the lesser curvature is occupied by the pylorus. Then we have the fundus portion and the cardiac portion. So the muscle of the stomach is divided into 3 layers. One is longitudinal. These are the longitudinal smooth muscles. Then we have the circular muscles, and we have the oblique layer of smooth muscle cells. So the fundus, the cells in the fundus are of 5 types, which are namely foveal cells, we have chief cells, we have parietal cells, G cells, and we have enterochromaffin cells that are located in the fundus area. So G cells are usually located in the parietal cells. So main type of cells that are located are in the fundus area are the chief cells and the parietal cells. Chief cells form the basal region. The chief cells are mostly present in this part of the region. So this is basically the histology of the stomach, comprising of cells, different types of cells. First, we should know the parts of these of this anatomy. One is the gastric pit. This is the gastric pit. Then we have the isthmus, the neck portion, and then we have the neck portion of this morphology, and then we have the base. So cells are continuously present throughout these histological morphology of the stomach. So first we have the foveal cells, which are present at the neck portion, and they produce mucus. Then we have chief cells that are present at the basal region, and then we have at the walls of the parietal cells are present at the walls are present the parietal cells, which secrete the HCl, the hydrochloric acid, which is the acid involved in the digestion in the stomach, and the intrinsic factor for the absorption of the vitamin B12. Then we have enterochromaffin cells that release histamine are present at the base area, and G cells that are present in the pyloric area. So this is the more cross section of the histology of the stomach. As you can see, there's a lamina propria, which is connective tissue. There are mucous epithelial cells. There's a neck portion, there's isthmus portion, and there is a base, and there is a neck portion. Now the cells of the gastric glands, which are the parietal cells, which secrete intrinsic factor and the HCl. Then we have G cells, which are present in the pyloric area, and it is nearly present in the neck area, produce a variety of the hormones. Then we have the chief cells that secretes pepsinogen, which an enzyme, a peptide hormone that initiates the release of the HCl, hydrochloric acid, for the digestion in the stomach. Now the reflex that is followed after the by the presence of the food in the stomach is the vasovagal reflex. So once the food enters the stomach, the mucous membrane of the stomach is stimulated. So afferent fibers, the afferent pathway becomes activated via the vagus nerve that reaches the medullary center, and from that center, efferent pathway comes via the vagus nerve and gets itself synapses with the intrinsic plexus. The long reflexes that connect or synapse form a synapses with the gastric glands, and the other part of the intrinsic plexus, they activate the G cells in the pyloric glands. So G cells in the pyloric glands release the gastrin, and there is a release of the gastric juice, which is helpful in the digestion of the food in the stomach and the mixing process. Now the motor functions of the stomach. The storage of food until it is processed in the duodenum. So the food once enters into the stomach, it cannot go pass down to the duodenum without mixing. So mixing of food is very important. How the mixing of food with the gastric secretions is done until it forms the semi-fluid mixture, which is called as chyme. Then once the chyme is formed, it is more semi-fluid and it empties itself into the small intestine for digestion and absorption. The stomach relaxes when food enters it because of the vasovagal reflex from the stomach to the brainstem and then back to the stomach. It reduces the tone in the muscular wall. The wall can bulge outward progressively, accommodating 1.5 liters in the relaxed state. The retropulsion mixing mechanism of the stomach is done. The peristaltic waves are generated passing over the antrum toward the pylorus. The pyloric muscle contracts, impeding emptying through the pylorus. Most of the antral contents squirted back towards the peristaltic ring, towards the body of the stomach. So it needs to be properly mixed before the food enters into the duodenum. So a chyme, a semi-fluid mixture, a chyme is formed, and once the chyme is formed, it passes along the antrum and makes an entry from the pylorus antrum into the duodenum. Now the pyloric sphincter that is present at the pyloric at the junction where the duodenum begins is the controlling center of the gastric emptying. So pyloric sphincter remains constricted, remains contracted once the chyme is formed, once the food is in proper fluid consistency, then it gets opened up or relaxed. Once it does, then the food or the chyme begins its entry into the duodenum. So gastric emptying inhibited by the enterogastric reflexes from the duodenum. As the quantity of chyme increases in the duodenum, the reflexes are initiated to send back a message to the stomach to slow down the emptying process. It depends on the degree of distension in the duodenum, the irritation in the duodenal mucosa, the acidity of the duodenal chyme, and the breakdown products of the chyme. So any distension in the duodenum can also send a message back to the stomach, or can squirt the food or the chyme back into the body of the stomach. So it needs to be properly broken down or digested down into the fluid consistency before it enters into the duodenum. Any irritation in the duodenum can activate the enterogastric reflexes from the duodenum. Cholecystokinin is another hormone that inhibits the gastric emptying. It is released from the mucosa of the jejunum by the presence of the fatty substances in the chyme. The more substances are present in the chyme, the more are the chances that cholecystokinin is becomes activated. They are released from the mucosa of the jejunum and decreases the process of the gastric emptying. So up till now we have discussed the process of ingestion. Once a bolus of food enters the mouth, there is a mechanical breaking down of food by teeth. Then there are salivary enzymes, amylases are present that further breaks down the food into more digestible forms. Then once the food is ready for making entry into the pharynx, the soft palate is pushed upwards against the blocking the nasopharyngeal area, and the food enters into the esophagus, makes an entry from the pharynx into the upper part of the esophagus. The epiglottis is usually lifts upwards and covers the laryngeal portion so that food doesn't get entry into the trachea, and the peristaltic waves are generated in the esophagus. There's a contraction and relaxation. So we have discussed all this process up till now. Then once the esophagus, the peristaltic waves, they are pushing the food into the stomach. Once it enters into the stomach, then the mixing of food begins. The gastrin is released, the pepsinogen enzymes are released, and hydrochloric acid is formed, which is breaking down the food into the fluid consistency, which we call as chyme. Once the chyme is formed, it passes down to the pylori of the stomach and makes itself ready for entrance into the duodenum. And we have discussed about the reflexes. The enterogastric reflexes from the duodenum are initiated once the duodenal mucosa is irritated or there are fatty substances in the chyme. So cholecystokinin, which is released from the mucosa of the jejunum to prevent or inhibits the gastric emptying. So a quick summary about the mixing and the emptying of the stomach. In this diagram you can see the food is entering down into the stomach and making a more fluid consistency with the help of the gastrin and the other hormones and the pepsinogen, and they are broken down into fluid consistency, a semi-fluid consistency. So once this is distended, once the chyme makes an entry passing down to the pylori, the pyloric sphincter it relaxes because of the distension in the duodenum, and the chyme is passed down into the duodenum. Increased irritational factors, the fatty substances causing the reflexes to be initiated in this part, and they are sending messages back to the stomach to inhibit the gastric emptying or delay the gastric emptying. Now the chyme has entered into duodenum, so there are movements in the small intestine that needs to be appreciated. Number one is segmentational contractions with the distension of the small intestine causing mixing contractions. There are concentric contractions. There are chain of sausages are formed because of the contraction and the relaxation of peristaltic contractions. Chops the chyme 2 to 3 times a minute, mixing of solid food with intestinal secretions. Then there are peristaltic waves. The chyme is propelled towards the anus at the velocity of 0.5 to 2 centimeter per second. 3 to 5 hours are required to move from pylori to the ileocecal valve. Now there are nervous and the hormonal signals. The peristaltic activity is increased after meal by following reasons: the gastroenteric reflexes by the distension of the stomach conducted by the enteric plexus along the wall of the small intestine. There is an entry of chyme into duodenum. There is a gastrin release from the G cells that are present at the pyloric antrum. The cells present there, they release the G cells, they release the gastrin. Then we have cholecystokinin that is present along the mucosal wall of the duodenum or of the jejunum, and the insulin are released after the meal, which increases the motility of the intestine. So cholecystokinin has dual action. One action is it inhibits the gastric emptying, and the other action is it increases the intestinal motility. So these are the mixing contractions. As you can see, there are the segmentations of the small intestine with the contraction and the relaxation of the intestinal wall. There is a stretching of the intestinal wall. The localized contractions are at interval levels. As one set of segmentation contraction relaxes, the contraction begins soon afterwards. A new set of 10 begins, but the contraction this time occurs mainly at the new points between the previous contractions. So the previous point of contractions will be the next point of relaxations in the next segmentation contractions. In this way, the chyme is moved forward or propelled forward towards the anus. So here the contraction, here's the relaxation. But in the next segmentation contraction, the relaxation point becomes a contraction point, and the relaxation point is the previous contraction point in the movements of the small intestine. So there are some factors, and the importance of the ileocecal valve needs to be considered in the movements of the small intestine. So first, the chyme once gets its entry into the small intestine after the segmentational contractions, it reaches to the point to the ileocecal valve, which remains contracted. It is present at the junction of the small intestine and large intestine. So it prevents the backflow. Ileocecal valve, the importance of the ileocecal valve is to prevent the backflow of the fecal contents from the colon into the small intestine. The lips of the ileocecal valve protrude into the lumen of the cecum and forcefully close. So the lid or the portion of the ileocecal valve is more towards the cecum area, which is the part of the large intestine, and it remains tonically constricted. Once it relaxes, it has a muscular cord called ileocecal sphincter, which is present at the wall of the ileum. They are mildly constricted, and it slowly empties the contents into the cecum. Now, the factors that causes the opening of the ileocecal valve are the distension in the cecum. There are enteric plexus from the cecum to the ileocecal sphincter and the ileum, and then we have extrinsic nerve plexus and the prevertebral sympathetic ganglia. So in this diagram, we're going to discuss the anatomy of the large intestine. As you can see, the ileocecal valve relaxes, the chyme or the contents enters into the cecum. Then we have the ascending colon, and then the transverse colon. Then we have the descending colon, and where the hostrations occur, the Hostra cells, which we're going to discuss later in the later slides. Then we have the sigmoid colon, from where the fecal matter makes its final exit through the internal anal sphincter, that gets relaxed and released by the relaxation of the external anal sphincter, and becomes and made and enters into the anal canal. We have movements of the colon, so the absorption of water and the electrolytes from chyme, which is mainly restricted to the proximal half of the colon, and then there is the storage of the fecal matter, which is the distal half containing the sigmoid portion of the colon. Then we have the contractions. There are circular muscles and the longitudinal muscle. There are unstimulated portions bulge outward into bag-like sacs called as the ostrations. There's a propulsion of the colonic contents. There's a mixing by the haustral contractions with the ding in and roll over the fecal material to the large intestine. So the haustral contractions, these are the contractions which are circular and the longitudinal, facilitated by the circular and the longitudinal muscles. The unstimulated portion, they bulge outwards into bag-like sacs, causing haustrations and propulsing, or there's a propulsion of the colonic contents into the anal canal. Then there are mass movements. There are concentric rings at the distended portion of the colon. Now distal to this portion, their contraction occurs. So once the fecal matter reaches the distended portion of the colon, the portion next to that distended portion, the contraction starts to occur there and pushing the fecal matter into the rectum. Now these are the circular and the longitudinal muscles of the colon. They are contractions, and this is the fecal matter pushing towards the anus. In the step 1, we can see the contraction of the circular muscles behind the food mass, and then the contraction of the longitudinal muscles ahead of the food mass. So they both are functioning together. The circular muscles contract behind the fecal matter, and the longitudinal muscles, they contract, or they function ahead of the fecal matter. And so in step 3, there's a contraction of the circular muscle layer, forcing the fecal matter more towards forward. So the both act in the same way and act together. The circular muscles, they are contracting behind the fecal matter, while the longitudinal muscles are contracting ahead of the fecal matter, and hence pushing the fecal matter more towards the anal area. Now the reflexes, gastrocolic and duodenocolic reflexes, they are conducted through enteric extrinsic nerves of the autonomic nervous system. Then we have the parasympathetic nervous system, and there is the extension of the stomach and duodenum, which initiating the reflexes, and there is an over distension of the colon by the fecal matter that initiates the reflexes from the colon to the brain centers, and then how this and the impulses are carried back with the extrinsic nerves of the autonomic nervous system to perform their function. So once the fecal matter reaches the sigmoid portion of the colon, there are the internal anal sphincters. They get themselves relaxed. The external anal sphincter also gets relaxed, and the fecal matter is pushed into the anal canal and ready for the defecation. So we're going to go into the detail of the defecation and its reflex. So defecation is the final act of digestion by which organisms eliminate solid, semi-solid or liquid waste material from the digestive tract via the anus. The intrinsic reflex mediated by the enteric nervous system. There is a distension of the rectal wall initiates the afferent signals that spreads to the mesenteric plexus. the peristaltic waves in the descending colon, sigmoid, and the rectum that also initiate the reflexes, the feces into the rectum. The internal anal sphincter relaxes by inhibitory signals from the mesenteric plexus together with the relaxation of the external anal sphincter, and that's how the defecation occurs. And intrinsic reflex is a weak reflex. It can if it is functioning itself. So parasympathetic defecation reflex needs to come into play or function together with the intrinsic reflex from the which are from the sacral segments of the spinal cord that intensifies the peristaltic waves and relaxes the internal anal sphincter. So once the fecal matter reaches the sigmoid colon, it is distended, peristaltic waves are generated, the reflexes stimulating the stretch receptors there, and receptors transmit the signals along the afferent fibers to the spinal cord neurons. So the afferent so there is an afferent pathway after distension in the sigmoid portion of the colon, and you can see there are the sensory nerve fibers moving into the spinal cord neurons. Now the impulses which are sent back from the neurons are the efferent pathways, and the spinal reflex is initiated, in which the parasympathetic motor or the efferent fibers stimulate contraction of the rectum and the sigmoid colon and the relaxation of the internal anal sphincter. So once the internal anal sphincter is relaxed, there is an involuntary motor nerve that is of the parasympathetic division relaxes the smooth muscle or the smooth muscle of the internal anal sphincter, and it enters into the rectal area. Now the external anal sphincter that also needs to be get relaxed, and it is done from the impulses from the cerebral cortex, the voluntary motor nerve to the external anal sphincter, and the external anal sphincter, hence which is the skeletal muscle, gets relaxed. So internal anal sphincter is a smooth muscle, and the external anal sphincter are the skeletal muscles. So in summary, we're going to summarize the whole discussion. So begin with we started with the ingestion, the process of the ingestion of food into the pharynx and then into the esophagus. We know there is saliva in our mouth that contains few enzymes that breaks down the food into more digestible forms. We have salivary amylases. Once the food enters, makes itself ready for the entrance into the pharynx, the soft palate is pushed upward against the nasopharynx. So food enters into the pharynx. The pharyngeal folds are moved medially, forming a sagittal plate, impeding the food back upwards into the mouth. So then the vocal folds are approximated. The epiglottis is lifted over the larynx so that food doesn't get itself enter into the trachea and causing the breathing problems. The peristaltic waves then begins in the esophageal area. These are the worm-like movements with the contraction and the relaxation. The contraction portion is behind the food, and the relaxation portion contains the food, and hence how that food makes itself enter into the stomach. So there is so in stomach, before it is moving down into the stomach, there is a lower esophageal sphincter which remains tonically constricted unless it is distended by the reflexes are initiated in the stomach by the distension in the stomach. So this sphincter is relaxed, and the food enters into the stomach, and they perform the motor functions. Once the food enters with the release of the gastrin from the G cells, the release of the HCl from the parietal cells, and the intrinsic factor causing the food to convert into more semi-fluid consistency, which we call as chyme. Once the chyme is formed, it passes down the pylori and moves into the duodenum, where the sphincter becomes relaxed and enterogastric reflexes are initiated by the distension of the duodenum. Once it enters into duodenum, then the small intestine, there's the contractions in the small intestines do occur, which we call as segmentation contractions. Now the segmentation contractions further pushes the food, or further propels the fecal matter into the towards the anus, and we can see there are contractions behind the matter, and there is a relaxation over here. So these segmentation contractions are at regular intervals. These contractions, the previous contractions are now the relaxation points in the next segmentation contractions. Like for example, we discussed the previous contractional point in the small intestine becomes a relaxation point, and so the relaxation point becomes the contractional point in the next segmentation contractions. So that's how the fecal matter is pushed into the towards the colon or the large intestine. Once it enters into the colon, so it has to pass to the ascending colon, the transverse colon, and then into the sigmoid colon with the help of the peristaltic waves. And there are two muscles, longitudinal muscles and the circular muscles, that are present along the wall of the large intestine. There is a contraction of the circular muscle that is behind the fecal matter, and there is and the longitudinal muscles that are present that contract in ahead of the fecal matter, and so the fecal matter is pushed more towards the anus and is ready for the defecation. We studied about the defecation, that once the fecal matters enters the sigmoid colon, the reflexes are generated, and they are passed down with the sensory efferent pathways into the neurons of the spinal cord, and the efferent pathway from the parasympathetic nerve supply makes itself enter into the distal mode at the distal portion of the rectal wall, where the internal anal sphincter is located, and making it to relax so that the fecal matter enters into the anal wall. The external anal sphincter, which is made up of the skeletal muscle, it relaxes, and so the defecation process occurs. So today we have touched the ingestion, the peristaltic movements in the esophagus. We have discussed about the anatomy of the stomach. We have discussed about the vasovagal reflex, the motor functions of the stomach, mixing and emptying of the stomach, and we have discussed about the movements of the small intestine, movements of the colon, the bag-like sacs, the contraction, the hostrations we have discussed, which are formed in the colon by the distension of the fecal matter, and the autonomic reflexes that affect the bowel activity, and we have discussed defecation and defecation reflex. I hope you guys understood my lecture. So thank you very much, and keep on watching sqadia.com.